species do in tomorrow as well. But now, Andy.
Good afternoon, or yeah, it's good afternoon. I'm excited to be here to talk about some work that we've been doing in the Seychelles since 2018. I also want to acknowledge Wayne Haslow, who joined us today as one of the pioneering guides who really worked out to figure out this fishery, not just for GTs, but milkfish and some other species. So Wayne, thanks for joining us. If you saw my talk yesterday, this is sort of drilling in a little bit about the GT work in comparison to thinking about the blue economy and sort of the alpha in the Seychelles. And thinking about a location where we could understand and test this idea of whether angler interactions have an influence on the fish. Okay. So just taking you to Alphonse Atoll, or to the Seychelles, Alphonse Island Group, here's Madagascar. 3 atolls, Saint Francois, Bouchiquet, and Alphonse. There's a lodge on Alphonse Atoll where the boats sit, and then most of the angling occurs over here in Saint Francois. So you can think about people hanging out here, lots of fishing going on over here. When we were first approached, it was really neat to see that the lodge already had a code of conduct in terms of how the fish were being caught and handled and released. So really focusing on catch and release fishery. They were limiting to 12 rods per day. There's only one operation there, so it's really easy to monitor angling activity. So it was really neat, a really good test bed for answering a lot of these questions related to movement ecology and also catch and release. What was also, there's Wayne. They also had a logbook. So all the guides had GPS watches, and whenever the premier target species, giant trevally, Indo-Pacific permit, triggerfish, and milkfish were caught, they marked the location of where those fish were being caught. So we had an indication of sort of spatial locations of angling effort and success rates. And so when we started to work with the guides, we really focused in on the questions that they had about the fishery. And one of the questions was, what are the spatial temporal trends, and why does it become more difficult to catch GTs? We focus specifically on GTs for this particular study. We used the logbook data, and we mapped out the catch rates, overall catch rates, and we had data from 2017 to 2020. And it makes sense that a lot of the catches were happening where the angling activity was, right? Because in terms of thinking of a guide's angler satisfaction. But then we were able to track over time that the catch rates sort of changed as the season progressed. There's month down here on the x-axis and catch rates on the y. There was a peak in sort of February, and then it dropped off as the season progressed. Was this related to their life history, or was it related to other factors such as angling pressure? We wanted to really drill in and sort of address some of these questions. Kind of have to. And so we use a number of techniques to do this. We used some of the same questions in terms of how are we addressing. So I'm doing this for Luke Griffin, who created the presentation. So I'm just trying to get caught up. Are we catching the same GTs, and how big is the population? So we using acoustic telemetry, pit tagging. We've pit tagged over 1,400 GTs. We've had a 5.9% recapture rate, and sometimes they're recaptured across a 2-week period and 4 kilometers apart, giving us a sense of the spatial movement patterns of GT. They don't move very far. And some individuals have been recaptured several times. It's a unique application of using pit tagging. But we did see some differences between the atolls, prompting questions about potential habituation. So we had some of the GTs that were caught around in Alphonse Atoll, where the lodge was, and some around Saint Francois. So then we switch gears in terms of methodologies, I think. Yes. And we started to use acoustic telemetry. This was at the same time as the pit tagging. And so we had over 50 receivers around both Saint Francois, Alphonse, and Bougettier. We've tagged over 75 GTs and started to look at their core use areas. And then we're able to also then map that in conjunction with the core use areas of the anglers. So we know that when the anglers are present, we know their catch rates and their success rates, whether the GT's there, and we know whether the GT's are there or not. Are they not being successful because the GT's aren't there, or are they not successful because the GT's maybe are getting a little wise, right? So it was an interesting way to start to address these questions about timidness and maybe a bit of habituation that might be happening because of provisioning. And so just to look at some of the data, hopefully drilling in a little bit more. Come on. All right. I'm just gonna like hopefully scroll through this and not, I'll get to this point. Oh, geez Louise. Okay, stay there. Okay, so for the GTs in yellow, the 95% space use is around 20, now the laser pointer's not working, 20 square kilometers. If you look at then the 50% catch area for the fly angle GTs, it was about 15 square kilometers, so there was 30% overlap. And if you then drill in though, come on. Uncomfortable silence. And then if you look at the 95% catch area, because anglers explore, guides explore, right? Because they want to think about their success rate, we end up with 84% overlap between where the guides and the GTs happen to be. And so in this particular setting, though, we were obviously focusing on those areas. You can see some areas where the fly angling was occurring, but there was no GTs being caught, right? Or in terms of the, not caught in terms of the acoustic telemetry data. Oh, geez, Louise. I apologize. Oh, my God. Okay, so so this is some, I'm leaning in on this paper in terms of like gaps in detections, right? We're all familiar with this when we're using acoustic telemetry of like when you don't hear an animal, where might they be? And so I'm not going to go into the details of this. This is something that Luke Griffin really thought about in terms of how do we understand the movement ecology of GTs in the presence of angling pressure. And so this is just as a point of reference. And so what we're able to then do is, as we were looking at the populations of a whole, we wanted to separate out the habituated GTs from the non-habituated GTs. And so I won't even try to play this animation because it'll just destroy things. Oh, geez Louise. Okay, so pretend there's some animation of somebody throwing a fish in the water and GTs being really hungry and crashing into it. And so what we wanted to do as we were analyzing the population as a whole is make sure we're separating out those that were being habituated from those being not. And so we had a lot of receivers down here by the dock. We were really concentrating on how we actually understand their behavior in comparison to the behavior of the GTs and the rest of the atoll, or series of atolls. And not surprisingly, but this is the first time we're able to kind of document this, is that is there a shift in movement strategies for those habituated GTs between the fishing season when there are anglers there and not? And so here were the non-habituated GTs and the restricted movements. That goes back to the paper that I showed you about whether in terms of how their spatial range is changing over time. And the red is outside the fishing season, the blue is during the fishing season, and you can see for the non-habituated fish, the ones who are at Saint Francois, there was no difference in terms of their restriction of movements. But if you look at the blue, and this is for the habituated GTs, during the fishing season, they had highly restricted movements. They wanted to be around and be fed. And outside the fishing season, we see that their movement patterns, we're exploring a little bit more. And so in terms of probability of restricted movements, again, non-habituated, the probability of restricted movements was same inside and outside the season. But when it came to habituated movements, or habituated fish, their movement patterns kind of changed a little bit. Being able to then add in, asking the question, do all animals do the same thing? And so we were able to look at the random effects of the GT movements relative to an average. And so we often think about GTs, do they all do the same thing? We think about it for tarpon and trout and all sorts of things. And there's a lot of variation in the population. If we focus on here, 0 is that there is no significant difference between departures from the way that they make their movement patterns from the restricted for non-restricted movements. If you go to the right, there are more restricted movements. If you go to the left, there are less restricted movements. And we can see where we've got habituated, the non-habituated adults and non-habituated juveniles, and there's still some variation that occurs. So understanding that there's individual differences within the movement patterns and the likelihood of habituation is something we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about the population as a whole. All right. But then we had also a natural experiment. When we initially conceptualized this study, we worked with the Alphonse Fishing Company to plan to temporarily close some of the finger flats to basically look at this idea of habituation and also sensitization to angler presence. And what happened right as we were beginning to close the finger flats, COVID hit, so we had a natural experiment, which was really cool. So pre-COVID, it's really cool to see. This is a drone shot, and there's a couple anglers in here. Pre-COVID, there was lots of angling pressure. During COVID, there was nothing. There was no angling at all. And we saw, 2 minutes, great. There was no significant difference before, during, and after COVID in terms of the movement patterns, which was kind of neat. But then we add in, this is the benefit, oh, sorry, next slide. What we're able to see is how do the movement patterns shift over time. We started to see, even though we were able to document there was no difference before, during, and after COVID, when we look across the fishing seasons, so we had transmitters in these fish for multiple years, we're looking at the same individuals over time, we were able to correct for their growth over time. We were able to see that over time, their probability of restricted movements went down. So they essentially changed their movement patterns as they became maybe wiser, not necessarily bigger, right? So it was corrected for that. We were able to then, and I showed this yesterday, we're also able to mesh this with some of the pit tag data that would give us a better indication about the potential for habituation. And so what we're able to demonstrate with this collective study was that we do see a shift in space use, movement shifts with angler activity, but not short-term closures. So there was a bit of a change when there were anglers present, and that change was able to be shown because of the capacity of the way we were monitoring angling activity, catch rates, and having the acoustic telemetry. There was some indication about avoidance behavior that frequent encounters suggest that there might be increasing timidity, maybe more timid, it's a tough word, and avoidance of fished areas. And when we're thinking about fishing capacity, this is one of the delights of this working in this location. It was one of the places where I was able to find out and look at carrying capacity. And so maybe angling pressure might, if we increase angling pressure in a situation like this, there might be more spatial avoidance and hook shyness. So the fact that they are limiting rod numbers and thinking about a code of conduct might influence the future of the fishery. And with that, I just want to thank all the organizations that supported the work. And if you have any questions about the sophisticated math, ask Luke.
time for one question, because we ran out of time.
Sorry.
People are hungry. Yes.
Thanks very much for the talk. Did you notice you tracked them for a number of years? And I'm thinking about the acoustic telemetry that was done on GTs on the South African coast, and there were those spawning migrations up at Mozambique. Did you notice anything in relation to spawning migrations?
Not at all. And so we had receivers both in the lagoon and on the edge of the lagoon. We haven't really looked deeply into some of the GTs had pressure sensors, the depth tags. But we really didn't necessarily document things related to spawning activity. Most of the GTs, they stuck around too. They were not moving away from these three atolls.
Okay. Thank you very much. And this closes today's session.